Paragraph 2. On the nature of organs. Know that the Creator, may His glory be exalted, has bestowed upon every living being and every organ a nature most suited to its function and circumstances, in accordance with its capabilities. However, proving this is the task of a philosopher, not a physician. The Creator granted humanity the most balanced nature possible in this world, in alignment with the forces through which we act and are acted upon. Likewise, He assigned each organ the nature most fitting for its role, some being warmer, others cooler, some drier, and others more humid. The warmest element in the body is pneuma, followed by the heart, which serves as the origin of pneuma. Next is blood, which, though generated in the liver, is closely linked to the heart and thus acquires a degree of heat greater than that of the liver. Following this is the liver itself, as it resembles coagulated blood. Then come the lungs, and after them, flesh. Flesh is less warm than the lungs due to the presence of cold nerve fibers running through it. Next in order are the muscles, which are cooler than plain flesh since they are interwoven with nerves and tendons. Following these are the spleen, which contains coagulated blood, and the kidneys, which hold a relatively small amount of blood. Then come the pulsating blood vessels, which are warm not because they possess a nervous substance, but because they are heated by the pneuma and blood within the arteries. After them are the non-pulsating vessels, warmed only by blood, and then the balanced nature of the skin on the palm. The coldest substance in the body is phlegm, followed by internal fat, external fat, hair, bones, cartilage, ligaments, tendons, membranes, nerves, the spinal cord, the brain, and the skin. The moistest substance in the body is phlegm, followed by blood, fat, internal fat, the brain, the spinal cord, the flesh of the nipple and testes, the lungs, the liver, the spleen, the kidneys, the muscles, and the skin. This is the order established by Galen. However, you should know that, in terms of its intrinsic nature, the lung is not highly moist, for every organ resembles the substance it feeds upon. In its accidental nature, it is influenced by what accumulates within it. Since the lungs are nourished by the hottest blood, most of which is mixed with yellow bile, their inherent moisture is moderate rather than excessive. This is exactly what Galen teaches us. However, a large amount of residual moisture accumulates in the lungs from the rising vapors of the body and the fluids descending toward the lungs. Because of this, the liver is naturally much more humid than the lungs, but the lungs become more saturated with moisture. Nonetheless, the continuous moistening makes the lungs more humid even in their substance. In a similar way, you should understand the state of phlegm and blood. The moisture of phlegm mostly comes from external saturation, while the moisture of blood is due to the concentration of liquid within its substance. However, natural watery phlegm itself can sometimes be wetter than blood. When blood reaches full maturity, a large amount of moisture disappears from it, as the natural watery phlegm within it transforms into blood. Later, you will learn that natural watery phlegm undergoes a certain transformation and becomes blood. As for the driest substance in the body, it is hair, for hair consists of smoky vapor, from which the mixed vapor has evaporated, leaving only the pure essence of smoke, which has condensed. Next are the bones, as they are the hardest organ, though bones are wetter than hair because they originate from blood and are positioned in a way that allows them to absorb and retain natural moisture. This is why bones serve as food for many animals, whereas no animal feeds on hair, or, perhaps, only very few do. For example, it is believed that bats can digest and easily swallow hair. However, if we take an equal weight of bones and hair and subject them to distillation in a flask or alembic, bones will release more liquid and fat, leaving behind less residue than hair. This means that bones are wetter than hair. Following bones in dryness are cartilage, then ligaments, tendons, membranes, arteries, veins, motor nerves, the heart, and sensory nerves. Motor nerves are both much colder and much drier than a balanced organ, whereas sensory nerves are colder but not significantly drier than a balanced organ. On the contrary, they are likely close to a balanced organ in terms of dryness and not too far from it in terms of coldness. The next in order is the skin. Paragraph 3. On the natures of different ages and sexes. There are 4 stages of age in total. The stage of growth, also called the age of youth, lasts until approximately 30 years. The stage of stabilization, or the age of young adulthood, ends around 35 or 40 years. The stage of decline, during which part of one's strength is preserved, is the age of maturity, lasting until about 60 years. Finally, the stage of deterioration, when strength begins to weaken, is the age of old age, which continues until the end of life. However, youth itself is divided into several phases. The infant stage is when the newborn's organs are not yet developed for movement or standing. Next is childhood, which begins after the child is able to stand, but before the body has fully strengthened, and while the milk teeth have not yet completely fallen out or been replaced. Then follows adolescence, which begins after the body has become stronger and the adult teeth have appeared, but before sexual maturity. After that is puberty, which lasts until facial hair begins to grow. Lastly, youth continues until the body's growth ceases. The nature of children, meaning the period from infancy to youth, is balanced in terms of heat, but exceeds the balanced state in terms of moisture. Ancient physicians disagreed on whether the body temperature of a child or a young adult is higher. Some believe that children have greater heat because they grow more rapidly. Their natural functions, appetite and digestion, are stronger and longer lasting, and the natural warmth inherited from the father's seed is more concentrated and fresher. Others argued that young adults possess significantly greater natural heat because their blood is more abundant and robust, which is why they experience frequent and heavy nosebleeds. Moreover, the nature of young adults tends toward yellow bile, whereas children's nature leans toward phlegm. Young adults exhibit stronger movements, and movement is driven by heat. They also absorb and digest food better, which is another function of heat. As for appetite, some suggest that it does not arise from heat, but rather from coldness, which is why canine appetite is often linked to a cold nature. The fact that young adults digest food more effectively is evident because they do not suffer from nausea, vomiting, and indigestion as frequently as children do. The tendency of young adults toward yellow bile is also proven by the fact that their illnesses are mostly associated with heat, such as 3-day fevers and bile-induced vomiting. On the other hand, children's illnesses are generally associated with moisture and coldness. Their fevers tend to be phlegmatic, and most of what they expel during vomiting consists of phlegm. The growth of children does not result from excessive heat, but rather from the significant moisture in their nature. More frequent manifestation of appetite in children also indicates a lack of heat in their nature. This is the teaching of both mentioned groups of doctors and their evidence. As for Galen, he opposes both of them at once. He believes that the heat in children and young men is essentially the same, but in children, the heat is greater in quantity and less in quality, that is, in sharpness. At the same time, in young men, the heat is lower in quantity but higher in quality, that is, in sharpness. The proof of this, as Galen says, is as follows. One must imagine a certain heat that is completely identical in quantity, or, in other words, a fine hot substance that is the same in both quality and quantity. Sometimes it spreads in a moist, abundant substance, like water, and sometimes it spreads in a dry, scarce substance, like stone. Since this is the case, we find that hot watery matter is greater in quantity and softer in quality, whereas hot stony matter is smaller in quantity and sharper in quality. Accordingly, judge the existence of heat in children and young men in the same way. Children are born from seed that abounds in heat, and nothing happens to extinguish this heat. After all, a child continuously develops, gradually grows, and has not yet stopped growing. How, then, can he regress in his development? As for young men, there are no causes that increase their heat, nor are there causes that extinguish it. On the contrary, this heat is preserved in young men by moisture, which decreases both in quality and quantity until they reach the age of decline. This mentioned scarcity of moisture is considered scarce not in relation to preserving heat, but in relation to growth. At first, moisture seems to exist in a quantity sufficient for both purposes. This amount preserves heat and also contributes to growth. Then, in the end, the amount of moisture becomes insufficient for both of these things, and then it turns out that there is not enough of it even for one of them. Meanwhile, the amount of moisture must be moderate so that it is enough for at least one of these two things without the other. However, it would be absurd to say that there is enough moisture for growth, but not enough to preserve natural heat. How can something increase if the factor that cannot preserve the foundation of the increasing thing is not enough? It turns out that this amount of moisture is only enough to maintain natural heat and not enough for growth. And it is known that the age when this takes place is the age of youth. As for the claim made by the representatives of the other group of doctors, stating that growth in children occurs solely due to moisture and not due to heat, this assertion is false. The fact is that moisture is the material of growth, and matter does not undergo change or acquire any qualities by itself, but only when acted upon by an active force. Here, the active force, by the will of the great and glorious Allah, is the soul or nature, and this force operates only through a certain instrument, namely, innate heat. The statement of these doctors that children's strong appetite is due only to the coldness of their nature is also false. Indeed, in the case of an unhealthy appetite caused by coldness of nature, food is not assimilated and does not nourish the body. However, in most cases, children assimilate food in the best possible way. If this were not so, children would not consume more nutrients, meaning food, than their bodies absorb in order to grow. At the same time, it happens that children do not assimilate food well due to gluttony and because they are not yet accustomed to what they eat. They consume harmful, raw foods in large quantities and then engage in harmful activities. As a result, excessive substances accumulate in their bodies more than necessary, and their bodies, especially their lungs, require more purification. Because of this, children's pulse is more frequent and tense than that of adults, and it lacks fullness since children's bodily strength is not yet fully developed. This is the reasoning about the nature of children and young people, as presented by Galen, and we have explained it in his words. Next, you must know that after the period of halted growth, heat begins to decrease due to the surrounding air absorbing its substance, meaning moisture. This process is assisted by innate heat, which is also found inside the body, as well as by mental and physical activities necessary for daily life, along with the body's inability to constantly resist this process. After all bodily forces are finite, as explained in natural philosophy, and their effect in introducing substances into the body is not constant. If these forces were not also finite and constantly introduced replacement substances into the body in the same equal quantity as what was absorbed, since absorption happens constantly and in the same amount every day, increasing over time even then, the replacement would still not be able to completely counteract absorption, and absorption would ultimately deplete moisture. And how could it be otherwise, when both factors mutually contribute to the emergence of moisture deficiency and the reverse development of the body? Given this, all of this must necessarily and inevitably destroy matter and even extinguish heat, especially since the extinction of heat is facilitated by another cause, namely, external moisture, which constantly arises due to the absence of replacement from digested food. This external moisture aids in the extinguishing of heat in two ways. First, it suffocates and drowns out the heat. Second, it opposes the heat with its own qualities, for this external moisture is slimy and cold. The extinction of internal heat is natural death, and for every person, in accordance with their original nature, this moment is predetermined until the end of the term during which their strength ensures the preservation of moisture in the body. For each of them, there is an appointed term, and for each term, a record, but this term varies among individuals according to the differences in their nature. Such are the cases of natural death, but there is also sudden death, which is another matter, and everything has its destiny. Thus, from what has been said, it follows that the bodies of children and young people are moderately warm, while the bodies of mature people and the elderly are cold. However, children's bodies, due to growth, are more moist than what is required for balance, and this is known through experience, by the softness of their bones and nerves, as well as through reasoning, for they were recently close to semen and to pneuma, which resembles vapor. As for mature people and especially the elderly, they are colder and at the same time drier. This is known through experience, by the hardness of their bones and the dryness of their skin, as well as through reasoning, for they were a long time ago close to semen, blood, and pneuma, which resembles vapor. Furthermore, the fiery element is the same in children and young people, but the airy and watery elements are greater in children. The earthy element is greater in middle-aged people and the elderly than in children and young people, and it is greater in the elderly than in middle-aged people. The balance of nature in a young person is higher than in a child, but compared to a child, a young person has a dry nature, whereas compared to an elderly and mature person, they have a warm nature. An elderly person is drier than a young person and a mature person in terms of the nature of their primary organs, but is more moist than them in terms of external, wetting moisture. As for the differences in the nature of people of different genders, women are naturally colder than men, which is why they are inferior to men in physical constitution, and their nature is more moist. Due to the coldness of their nature, women have more bodily residues, and the lack of physical exercise makes their flesh more loose. Although men's flesh is loose in terms of its combination with the substances entering it, due to its overall roughness, it is more strongly cooled than the vessels and nerve fibers passing through it. The inhabitants of northern countries have a more moist nature. People whose work is associated with water are more moist by nature, while those who are the opposite are, on the contrary, drier. As for the signs of nature, we will discuss them when we talk about general and specific characteristics. Chapter 4. About juices in 2 paragraphs. Paragraph 1. On the nature of juices and their components. Juice is a moist, flowing substance into which food initially transforms. There are two main types of juice. The first is the beneficial juice, whose purpose is to transform, either alone or in combination with something else, into a part of a nutrient or become similar to a nutrient, essentially replacing the dissolved portion of nutrients within the body. The second type is the excessive and impure juice, which does not serve this function and rarely converts into beneficial juice. Its fate is to be expelled from the body before it can be fully processed into a good juice. In general, bodily fluids are classified as primary and secondary. The primary fluids are the four main juices, which will be discussed further. The secondary fluids are divided into two categories, those that are considered excess and those that are not. The excess fluids will be addressed later, but the non-excess fluids are those that change from their original state and pass through organs without fully integrating as a fundamental part of any single organ. There are four types of such fluids. 1. The first type is the liquid found in small cavities at the ends of tiny vessels adjacent to primary organs, nourishing them with blood. 2. The second type is a fluid dispersed within the primary organs like dew. It can transform into nutrients when the body lacks food and moisturizes the organs when they dry out due to intense movement or other causes. 3. The third type is a recently thickened fluid, food that has been processed into organ material through mixing and assimilation, but is not yet fully transformed into its final state. 4. The fourth type is the moisture that enters the primary organs from the beginning of growth, binding organ particles together. This moisture originates from a drop of seed, and the seed itself comes from juices. We shall also say that the moistures of juices, both beneficial and excessive, are contained in four substances. These four substances are blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Among them, blood is the most superior. Blood is naturally warm and moist and exists in two forms, natural and unnatural. Natural blood is red, has no foul odor, and is very sweet in taste. Unnatural blood is of two kinds. 1. It can change and lose its beneficial nature without any external contamination, simply due to an internal imbalance, such as becoming too cold or too hot. 2. It can change due to an external impurity mixing with it. This contamination can occur in two ways. An external substance enters the blood and corrupts it. A transformation within the blood itself occurs, such as when part of the blood decays, its liquid portion turning into yellow bile and its thick portion into black bile, with one or both of these remaining in the bloodstream. The composition of unnatural blood varies depending on what mixes with it. It may contain different types of phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, or watery moisture. This variation affects its consistency, thick or thin, color, very dark or light, smell, and taste, bitter, salty, or sour. On phlegm. Like blood, phlegm can be natural or unnatural. Natural phlegm is the type that can eventually transform into blood, as phlegm is essentially immature blood. This type is known as sweet phlegm. It is not excessively cold. Compared to the body, it is only slightly cold, but relative to blood and yellow bile, it is indeed cold. Unnatural sweet phlegm is tasteless, often appearing when mixed with natural blood. This will be discussed further. Such phlegm is frequently observed in bodily discharges and phlegm expelled from the mouth. The role of sweet phlegm in the body. The physician Galen stated that nature did not assign phlegm a specific storage organ, like the gallbladder for bile, because phlegm closely resembles blood and is needed throughout the body. It is distributed in the body similarly to blood. The body's reliance on phlegm arises from two factors, necessity and benefit. 1. Necessity. Phlegm must remain near the organs so that when external food supply is unavailable, it can transform into good blood, which can then be absorbed by the stomach and liver for nourishment. On the transformation of phlegm and its various forms. Phlegm can turn into blood due to external influences, specifically heat, which matures, digests, and assimilates it. Just as natural heat ripens phlegm, transforming it into healthy blood, external heat can spoil and corrupt it. This property is unique to phlegm. Neither yellow nor black bile shares its ability to transform into blood under natural heat. However, like phlegm, bile is susceptible to decay when exposed to excessive heat. The two necessary functions of phlegm. 1. Supporting blood composition for certain organs. Phlegm must mix with blood to nourish organs that have a phlegmatic nature, such as the brain. Blood supplying these organs must contain a specific proportion of phlegm. The same applies to both types of bile, which also need to be present in blood in proper balance. 2. Moisturizing joints and moving parts. Phlegm lubricates joints and body parts involved in movement, preventing them from drying out due to friction. This function is not just beneficial but necessary for bodily function. Unnatural forms of phlegm. Unnatural phlegm includes residual phlegm of varying thickness, which can be perceived through the senses. Nasal mucus is a type of residual phlegm. Some phlegm appears to have a uniform consistency, but is actually variable in texture. This is known as raw phlegm. Watery, extremely thin phlegm is considered unnatural, as is excessively thick phlegm. White, plaster-like phlegm, gypsum phlegm, is a dense form in which the liquid portion has evaporated due to prolonged retention in joints and passages, making it highly concentrated. Salty phlegm, the most heated and dry type. Salty phlegm is the hottest, driest, and least watery form of phlegm. Its salinity arises when earthy, burnt, and naturally dry particles mix evenly with a weakly flavored or tasteless watery substance. If these burnt particles are in excess, they give phlegm a bitter taste, leading to the formation of salts in bodily fluids. This process mirrors salt production, where substances like ash, potash, and lime are boiled in water until the solution thickens and salt crystallizes. Thus, tasteless or mildly flavored phlegm becomes salty when mixed with burnt, dry bile, turning into bile-infused phlegm that is both salty and heated. On the opinions of Galen regarding salty phlegm, the esteemed physician Galen stated that phlegm becomes salty either due to decay or because of an admixture of watery substances. However, we assert that decay makes phlegm salty because it involves burning, leading to the formation of ash, which then mixes with its moisture. As for the wateriness mixed with decayed phlegm, water alone does not cause salinity unless the second factor, burnt residue, is present. It seems that in Galen's statement, the word or should instead be and, making the explanation more complete. On sour phlegm. Phlegm can also be sour. Just as sweet phlegm exists in two forms, naturally sweet and sweet due to external admixture, sour phlegm also has two causes. 1. External impurity, such as sour black bile, which will be discussed later. 2. Internal transformation, a process similar to what happens with other sweet juices. Initially, they start to ferment. Eventually, they turn sour. On astringent phlegm. Astringent phlegm follows the same pattern as other types of phlegm. Sometimes, its astringency comes from black, astringent bile. Other times, it results from excessive cooling, which causes the watery part of phlegm to solidify, making it slightly earthy due to dryness. Because of this, mild heat cannot make such phlegm ferment and turn sour, and strong heat cannot make it ripen. On glassy phlegm. Another form is glassy phlegm, which is thick and dense, with a viscous consistency similar to molten glass. It can be either sour or tasteless. It seems that the thick portion of tasteless glassy phlegm is raw phlegm or eventually turns into raw phlegm. This type of phlegm was originally watery and cold. It did not rot or mix with any impurity, but it remained compressed for so long that it thickened and became even colder. The 4 types of bad-tasting phlegm. Phlegm with an unpleasant taste falls into 4 categories. 1. Salty. 2. Sour. 3. Astringent. 4. Tasteless. The 4 types of phlegm by composition. 1. Watery. 2. Glassy. 3. Nasal. 4. Gypsum-like. Additionally, raw phlegm is classified as a type of nasal phlegm. On yellow bile, natural and unnatural forms. Yellow bile, like other bodily fluids, exists in 2 types. 1. Natural yellow bile. 2. Residual, unnatural, yellow bile. Natural yellow bile. Natural yellow bile is the foam of the blood. It is bright red, light, and sharp, and the hotter it is, the redder it becomes. When bile is produced in the liver, it is divided into 2 parts. One part circulates with the blood. The other part is filtered into the gallbladder. The bile that mixes with the blood does so for necessity and benefit. Necessity. Some organs require a healthy portion of bile for their natural function, for example, the lungs. Benefit. Bile helps thin the blood, allowing it to flow through narrow pathways. The bile stored in the gallbladder also serves both necessity and benefit. Necessity. It helps the body eliminate waste. It nourishes certain organs by providing bitterness. Benefit. 1. It washes away mucus and residue from the stomach. 2. It stimulates the intestines and rectal muscles, creating the urge for defecation. This explains why pain can occur if the bile duct leading from the gallbladder to the intestines is blocked. Unnatural yellow bile. There are 2 ways in which yellow bile becomes unnatural. 1. By mixing with foreign substances. 2. By internal alteration of its own nature. The first type of unnatural bile is well known. This happens when bile mixes with phlegm, which usually occurs in the liver. The second type is less known and involves an admixture of black bile. Variations of unnatural yellow bile. Common unnatural yellow bile is either bright yellow, egg yolk colored. This difference occurs because if thin phlegm mixes with bile, the bile becomes bright yellow. If thick phlegm mixes with bile, it takes on an egg yolk color. A lesser-known type of bile is called burnt bile, which arises in two ways. 1. Self-burning bile. It becomes ashy. The liquid and golden portions do not separate, making it the worst form of bile. This type is called burnt bile. 2. Black bile admixture. Black bile enters and mixes with yellow bile. This is a more favorable condition. If this bile appears reddish, it still lacks a pure, bright color. Instead, it resembles blood but remains thin and altered in color for various reasons. On bile that loses its natural state. Some types of bile are unnatural due to their substance, meaning they originate in an abnormal way. There are two main types. 1. Bile that mostly originates in the liver. 2. Bile that mostly originates in the stomach. 1. Liver-originating bile. This type occurs when the liquid part of the blood burns excessively, and its thicker portion turns into black bile. 2. Stomach-originating bile. This type of bile has two variations. 1. Leek-colored bile, greenish. 2. Verdigris-colored bile, bluish-green, like oxidized copper. Leek-colored bile. This originates from burnt egg yolk-colored bile. When egg yolk bile overheats, it darkens. The mixture of yellow and black creates a greenish shade. Verdigris-colored bile. This develops from leek-colored bile when it burns even further. The extreme heat removes moisture, causing it to turn pale. The process resembles burning wood. At first, it blackens, like coal. Then, as heat destroys moisture, it turns grayish-white, like ash. This verdigris-colored bile is the hottest, most dangerous, and most lethal. Some believe it forms from poisonous substances. On black bile, natural and unnatural forms. Like yellow bile, black bile exists in two types. 1. Natural black bile. 2. Residual, unnatural, black bile. Natural black bile. This is the thickest part of good blood. It is heavy and settles at the bottom. Its taste is bittersweet and astringent. When black bile originates in the liver, it is divided into two parts. One part enters the bloodstream for necessity and benefit. Necessity. Some organs require a portion of black bile for proper function, e.g., bones. Benefit. Black bile strengthens the blood, thickens it, and prevents excessive dilution. The role and types of black bile. A portion of black bile is directed to the spleen. This is the part not needed by the blood. It moves to the spleen out of necessity and for a purpose. Necessity. It may apply to the whole body, in which case it serves to cleanse the body of excess substances. Or it may apply to a specific organ, meaning it nourishes the spleen. Benefits of black bile. When black bile reaches the stomach, it serves two main functions. 1. It strengthens the stomach's opening, making it firmer. 2. Its acidity irritates the stomach, stimulating hunger and increasing appetite. Analogy with yellow bile. The yellow bile that seeps into the gallbladder is the portion not needed by the blood. Likewise, the black bile that flows into the spleen is the portion not needed by the blood. The black bile that leaves the spleen is the portion not needed by the spleen. Just as certain types of yellow bile stimulate the downward movement of bodily fluids, certain types of black bile stimulate their upward movement. Blessed be Allah, the best of creators and the most just of judges. Unnatural black bile. Unnatural black bile does not form due to sedimentation or thickening, but rather due to charring and ash formation. When moist substances mix with earthy substances, they separate in two ways. 1. By sedimentation as seen in blood, where natural black bile settles. 2. By burning, where the liquid part evaporates, leaving only the dense residue. An example of this process is residual black bile, often called black bitterness. Differences in bodily fluids. Blood can produce a sediment, but mucus cannot, due to its viscosity. Yellow bile is thin and constantly in motion, with little earthiness, so it barely sediments. When yellow bile separates from blood, it either rots immediately or spreads through the body. If it rots, its liquid part dissolves, leaving a burnt black bile residue, which does not sediment. Types of residual black bile. 1. Ash and residue of burnt yellow bile, bitter in taste. 2. Ash and burnt mucus. If the mucus was very watery, the residue is salty. Otherwise, it is sour or astringent. 3. Ash and burnt blood, salty and slightly sweet. 4. Ash and burnt natural yellow bile. If the yellow bile was thin, its residue is very sour, like vinegar, even boiling on the ground with a smell that repels flies and insects. If the yellow bile was thick, its residue is less sour, with a slightly astringent and bitter taste. The three types of harmful black bile. 1. Burnt yellow bile, where its liquid part has dissolved. 2. Two other forms of residual black bile mentioned above. On the mucus black bile and the nature of bodily humors. Mucus black bile is less harmful and acts more slowly than other types. When the four bodily humors are burned, they follow a specific order of increasing harmfulness. 1. Black bile is the most harmful, particularly when it forms from yellow bile. However, this type is also the most treatable. 2. Among the other two types, the sourer variety is more harmful, but if treated early, it responds well to treatment. The third type does not boil as aggressively on the ground, adheres less to organs, and causes damage more slowly. However, it is harder to dissolve, mature, and treat with medicine. The role of natural and residual humors. Galen stated, "It is incorrect to claim that only blood is a natural humor, while the rest are mere waste products and entirely unnecessary. This reasoning is flawed because, if blood were the only nourishing humor, all organs would share the same nature and composition. For example, bones would not be harder than flesh without the presence of black bile's solid component. The brain would not be softer than flesh without the addition of mucus elements. Even blood itself is a mixture of different humors. When drawn and left in a vessel, it separates into distinct components. 1. A foamy layer, yellow bile. 2. A substance like egg white, mucus. 3. A sediment or dregs, black bile. 4. A liquid part, watery moisture, which exits the body through urine. Watery moisture is not a humor because it originates from non-nutritive drinks. Its only role is to dilute food and aid digestion. In contrast, humors are derived from nutritive food and drink. The term nutritive refers to substances that resemble the body's composition in potential. The relationship between blood, strength, and humors. Some believe that an abundance of blood equals physical strength. A lack of blood, anemia, causes weakness. This is incorrect. What matters is not the quantity of blood, but its quality, how well the body extracts and utilizes its nutrients. Others argue that as long as the humors exist in correct proportions to each other, health is maintained, even if their overall quantity is too high or too low. However, this is also incorrect. Each humor must be present in its proper absolute quantity, not just in relation to the others. At the same time, humors must also maintain the right proportional balance. The limits of medical inquiry. Certain philosophical questions about humors extend beyond medicine and belong to the domain of philosophy. For this reason, they are left unexamined in medical discourse.